Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. I'm Arjuna, and today I'm joined by my good friend Jonathan Lyonhart. We actually went to high school together and went to the same Christian summer camp. So, John, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I guess I'm the Western skeptic in the Eastern spirituality meets Western skepticism.
Yeah, that's the tagline I made up, and I just use it even when it's not applicable. Today we're doing something different. I'll be interviewing a Christian. It's more like an interfaith discussion, but we'll be talking about his new book called Divine Space, which defends a view of God and a view of space and talks about science and theology and philosophy. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's the basic idea.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Do you want to just take a minute to say something about yourself? And you've also got your own podcast with...
Yeah. So I'm an assistant professor at assistant professor of theology and philosophy at Lincoln Christian University in the States. And I'm also a co-host of the Spiritually Incorrect podcast, which, we do YouTube, Spotify, all of that type of stuff. We cover any sort of crazy out there idea, whether it's psychedelics or ghosts or deeper philosophical theological issues. We try to tackle anything and everything that draws our interest, but we do it with leading experts. So we did do an episode on ghosts recently, but we had an MIT professor who did it with us. So we try to do the craziest things possible, but in the most educated way we can. That's the podcast.
Nice. We'll have a link to that in the description.
Yeah.
And his co-host is awesome too, Seth Hart. He's been on the channel many times.
He's overrated, but yeah, he's a great. So, yeah.
Okay, so I was trying to get my head around this book. We mentioned just a minute ago. I listened to it. I got an app called Speechify to read it to me, which he was saying it must have been a painful book to listen to, but the AI text to speech isn't that bad these days, and I'm kind of used to it. So we might make this a bit of an interfaith discussion, but I don't know so much about the philosophy of what the Hare Krishna's ideas on space would be, but I know there's statements about like God, Krishna saying he's time, I am the destroyer of all, and I think some of your arguments about space might apply to time. Do you want to give one or two of the arguments? Well, first of all, what's the view? Is it called divine space? Is that the name of the view? Is it like hylomorphism as a view, and your view is divine space?
Yeah, so I mean, the book title is Space God: Rejudging a Debate Between Moore, Newton, and Einstein. And I guess I should just give a brief summary of what the book actually is. Yeah. So basically, there was this guy in the 1600s, a Cambridge Platonist named Henry Moore, who was thinking about space. What is this thing that we all exist within? And he reasoned about it for a little while. He said, well, space is omnipresent because you can't go anywhere except by going through space. To go anywhere is to go there in space. And so space is inherently omnipresent because you can't go anywhere except by going through space. Space is also invisible. You can see things in space, objects within space, but you can't really see the space itself. It's almost invisible. And he also reasoned that space is seemingly infinite. As soon as you try to imagine a wall at the edge of space, you can imagine shooting an arrow over the wall. And so it's almost self-inherently refuting to imagine an end to this infinite in Henry Moore's thinking. Space is also intimate and immediate and imminent because, hey, I'm in space right now. Like, we're having this interview in space. I'm moving through space. It's very close and personal. And it's not just out there like outer space. It's also inner space. There's space inside of me. There's space in my heart cavity, and my heart itself exists in space. Space is closer to me than I am to myself. And yet, despite that immanence and closeness, space is also transcendent. There's a sense in which you can't grab space or twist it or rip it the way that you could a material object. Space is kind of the only thing that's really present, but which you can't quite touch or grasp or control like an object. You can hold things within space, but you can't hold space itself. Space is this weird intermediary thing. in More's mind. It's where metaphysics and physics meet, because it's not the material world. Material objects, material creation exists in space, but space isn't identical with the objects that exist within it. And so Moore went through and described all these things about space. It's infinite, it's invisible, it's transcendent, and yet also immanent, it's omnipresent. And somewhere through having this conversation with himself, he realized, well, heck, that's how we talk about God. God is invisible. God is supposed to be omnipresent. And Moore is operating within the Western Christian tradition, and God seems to have all these attributes. God is infinite. God is transcendent, but also immanent. And very important within Moore's tradition is the creator-creature distinction. We want God to be very close, but we want God to be distinct from creation. And this gave Moore a new way to articulate that, where, if space is in some sense divine or an extension of the divine, God is very close. I mean, I'm in space right now, and yet space is not identical with the objects that exist within it. And so God can be distinct from material creation because matter exists within space, and yet very close and near to that material creation. And so it allowed God to be very close and immanent, but also simultaneously transcendent. And so Moore thought, well, heck, what if we just said that God is in some sense space, or space is some aspect of the divine, and let's run with that. And that would just be sort of a crazy idea, except Isaac Newton was also at Cambridge at the same time that Moore was, and Newton came on board. He bought into divine space, and he actually baked it into the foundation of his physics. And so there's a real historical claim to be made that divine space is the metaphysical foundation of the scientific revolution. And so there's a really interesting historical case there, and I get into that in the book. But I also make a constructive case, which is, well, this is a weird idea, but does it still have any constructive validity? Is it something we can still believe in today, especially post-Einstein and the relativization of space? Can we still believe in divine space post-Einstein? Is it theologically orthodox in the Western tradition that Moore talked about? Or maybe not, but then maybe it's of appeal to a different tradition than Moore's. Who knows? These are the types of questions I get into the book. So,
yeah, that's quite interesting. There's lots of directions we could go with that, but I guess the next step might be like, where does the debate currently sit? Is this an idea that's thought about? Is it contradictory with hylomorphism or other Christian metaphysical views, or has it kind of not gotten the attention it deserves?
I'm probably, to my knowledge, the first person that's tried to bring this up as an actual discussion in a while. There was an author named Robert Oakes who published something a while back. It was just a short 7-page thing, just sort of discussing part of this. But this isn't a conversation many people are having. And I think this is the only book that I know about that's actually saying, hey, what of God's space? And I'm not totally sold on the idea. I wouldn't say that I'm the divine space guy who believes in this. I just think it's worth talking about. I'm not even sure what to make of it myself. I think where it does fit into a broader Christian discussion is this transcendence and immanence question, which I don't think specific to Christianity. I mean, this is in many ways the question. How close is God to us? Are we identical with God? Those sort of ontological questions. I mean, those are pretty much foundational questions across a number of religions, and I think it's in that zone. How can we make God close without making God just identical with us, without totally collapsing it in a sort of monistic sense? Which some people might be just like, hey, let's do that. Let's collapse it in a monistic sense. But I at least don't want to do that. And yet I still want God to be very close and near to me. And so that's a hard thing to do. It's hard to not slip into completely collapsing into God while still holding distinctions and those types of things and still allowing God to be close. So, and in the Christian, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to ask next, what sort of reaction have you gotten from, well, I guess one category would be the Christian population in general, another would be from academics.
Yeah. So this is still a really new book, so I don't know what the reaction is going to be.
Right.
My general sense is that most people just go, "You're doing what?" This is it sounds really weird.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that a bit, because I mean, hearing it, people might misunderstand what you're saying, or they might understand it and just be really confused why you'd even talk about it. So, like, it can a misunderstanding might be like, well, if you're saying God's space, like, is that like the God of Spinoza? Or are you just saying God's the universe? Like, and like one objection to the God of Spinoza is like, are you just taking something that exists, that atheists believe exists, and then changing the meaning, the word we use for it, just retitling it God, and somehow then atheists become theists?
Voila. No, well, I'll take that piece by piece. I think the first thing is to say that Henry Moore, the guy I'm talking about here, exists at the same time as Spinoza, and he hates Spinoza. Okay. In some ways, you can see his idea as an attempt to avoid Spinoza. Because on the one hand, he wants God to be very close. And the Christian tradition does believe God is close. God is omnipresent. God is incarnate. And yet the Christian tradition also doesn't want to collapse the distinction between the creator and the creature. And that's always been the tension, is how do we do both of those things at the same time? And I think Moore would say, a lot of traditional medieval Christian theology hasn't really made God all that close. They've evacuated God from the created world and just sort of located God up there out in some transcendent never land. And they've never quite made sense of how God can also be close. And what Moore would say is, by making God space, God is as close to us as we are to ourselves, because God's right here. This is space. God is here. And yet there's still a crucial distinction between the creator and the creature there, because while space is close to the material objects that exist within it, it is not identical with those objects. You could destroy all the matter and all the material things, and space would still exist there. And so God can be close to creation as space without being identical to material creation. And so this is a way to do what Christians want to do, which is make God close to the world without falling into Spinoza, because God is the space of created matter, but is not created matter itself.
So I think there's some parallels there to the Chaitanya Vaishnava, or aka Hare Krishna tradition, of like, when we're doing philosophy and looking at the world and breaking down ideas, the things we're trying to preserve and the things we're trying to exclude, the things you just mentioned, we're also trying to preserve and exclude the same things. We want to maintain a distinction, but also maintain a closeness. So there's this thing we call simultaneous oneness and difference. So we're one with God in a way. We're the same quality, but we're different from God. Quality in terms of we're just a tiny portion. We're conscious. We have personality. God's conscious. God has a personality, and that means we can have a loving relationship. But we're also different, which means we can have a loving relationship because I can't have a loving relationship with myself. There needs to be some difference.
You can, but
that's different.
Yeah.
But another point I could bring up from our tradition is there's a lot of talk in our tradition of everything being an emanation from God. So any quality you find anywhere is a quality that emanates from God. So like the enjoyment of a nice racing car, that enjoyment, you're actually enjoying God's potency, and it's just kind of like a dried up way of enjoying it because it's like a perverted reflection in the material world. Whereas it's like the reflection of the tree in the water, that the reflection has the qualities of God, but it's perverted. It's upside down. You can destroy it. The tree might have fruit. If you jump in the lake and try to eat the fruit, you're going to be disappointed. Whereas if we go to the spiritual world, if we go directly to God, we're not disappointed, but we find all the same qualities. So with there's things you speak about space, so we would understand everything is God's energy. So the qualities that we describe as space, they are God's qualities directly.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, Henry Moore being a Cambridge Platonist, he has that Plotinus sort of background, perhaps, where he could be connecting to emanations. Because in the Western tradition, Plotinus and Plato are often the camp that's connected with emanations and the divine emanating out stuff. And I think there's a natural way in which to say that perhaps space and time are just emanations of the divine. And so God is somehow more than those things. They're not quite the whole thing. And I certainly would never. Again, I don't necessarily agree with Moore, but even if I were to, I wouldn't say that space exhausts all that God is, but rather is one reflection or extension of the divine. And I think whenever we're talking about transcendent things like space and time, I think it's natural to see those as emanations of being or the higher divine entity. I mean, that makes sense to me. So, yeah,
Yeah,
I wouldn't see those. Go ahead.
there's also in our tradition something a little bit technical, which is that there's Krishna, and then his first emanation is Balaram, and Balaram is actually everything that serves God. So when God like appears in the material world, which different, obviously your tradition has different ideas, Balaram actually becomes like the ground, like everything. So Krishna's not interacting with the material world. Balaram becomes all those things as so it's actually everything spiritualized. But I don't know how much that relates to that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is this sense in which it sounds like you're also wanting the divine to be close, but also distinct and not wash away all distinctions and that sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is we see it that everywhere is the spiritual world, even though we have this idea of going home to the spiritual world, like a kind of misunderstanding of Christianity where you think it's up there in the sky somewhere. I think that's more directly the Vaishnava view. But it's mistaken to think that it's completely different place. It's that everything is the spiritual world, everything is God's energy, but we see it as different. Because we've forgotten God and we're under this illusion where we're able to see things as separate from God, but there's actually no reality to anything being separate from God.
Yeah. So would you say that everything that is indeed real about this reality is the divine, and the parts that aren't real about this are just a privation or a lack or an absence?
We're just looking at it in a confused way. So basically, like anyone in any circumstance can change their headspace to where they see the divine in everything. And I mean that might sound extreme. How do you see God and starving children and all these other things? But you see like souls present there. You see that they're on a soul building journey, and you see purity in that because underneath the surface, all souls are pure. And so this idea that anything is separate from God is just a confused way of looking at the world.
Could I ask? So, I can understand someone seeing good in the midst of darkness. The hard part I have is not just seeing good in the midst of darkness, but seeing all of the darkness is actually good in some way. Like I can imagine a child smiling in a concentration camp and there being a hint of joy there, and like, yes, even in this dark place there is this shred of humanity. And yet I wouldn't go so far as to say therefore the concentration camp isn't dark, it's actually light. Like I would still believe there really is darkness there. Maybe a little bit of light got through, but that really is dark.
Without being on that level, I can't really comment because I'm not on that level of spiritual awareness, so I can't really say what it's like to see the world that way. But I can repeat some ideas I've heard and put some thoughts together on it. So one thing I think that's worth saying is there's a variety of spiritual emotions. So the self-realized soul who sees God in everything is not going to have the same emotion when they look at the starving child as when they look at somebody worshiping in a church who's not starving, or various other things. There's a variety of spiritual emotions, and while they're all spiritual, they're also different from one another. And so I think the emotions would still be appropriate to the situation and not just seeing everything as all the same all the time. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so there's different ways of sort of emotionally engaging with reality. Are those emotions just in our sort of subjective lower level perception of things down here, or are you saying no,
Yeah, even at the
at this
top,
sort of,
even at the
even at
highest
the top?
levels, you don't just look at
Okay,
everything and have the same
the
emotion
same.
at everything you look at. There's still a variety of emotions that are fully pure and spiritual.
So are those, I mean, I don't think of anger as a negative emotion. I think of that as an inherently good emotion, and yet it can be misused and so on and
Yeah,
so
it's
forth.
something like that. Yeah. I mean,
But
like
isn't, go
we,
ahead.
we have the example of Prabhupada, who we take to be a pure devotee on the highest level, who founded the Hare Krishna movement in the West. And when he was in West Bengal and they were opening a temple there, and he saw children fighting with dogs over food scraps, like dogs, like the wild dogs in India, and the children were fighting with the dogs over like the rubbish food that had been dumped somewhere. He cried and he said, we make it the case that nobody goes hungry within 10 kilometers of one of our temples. So then they started a food distribution program. But that emotion of looking at those starving children, the reaction's different. It's appropriate to the situation, but there's still a way of seeing God in that situation. But yeah, your question was more specific of how do you see it as a good thing, and I think that would be as I mean, if you want to believe God is both all powerful and all good, then it has to be the case that even the dark situations, God's permitting those to exist in order to bring about a higher good. And if you're on a really deep level where you can see God in everything, you're going to be able to see aspects of that higher good and how these are necessary to get people to where they need to go spiritually.
Yeah, I think I can take the view that there are negatives that exist that had to be allowed to exist, but I wouldn't then see those negatives as good things in themselves. So I believe God created free will in order that our choices would mean something when we choose love or choose to love other people or choose to love God. But I think because of that, we can also choose to create things that aren't good. We can choose to kill. And so I don't think when we choose to kill or hurt each other that God is saying, yes, that's good. That's part of it. That's all me in the end. I think, no, that actually isn't good. And you might be able to say, well, there's still little pieces of goodness in that. Like the way that he slashed the blade, that was took a lot of strength and accuracy and skill. And like those things can really legitimately be good, but that doesn't mean the act in its entirety is good. I think I would see evil as really existing, and not being part of the plan and
I,
not just secretly God in some way.
I think a good way to think of it might be with an analogy to a prison. So, objectively speaking, or even a hospital, objectively speaking, a Western developed country that has a prison system and hospitals is better than one that doesn't. But is it a good thing that hospitals and prisons exist? The fact that they exist means that there's either sick people who are in bad health and need help getting better, or there's mentally sick people who break laws and need to be removed from society. And presumably, if it's a divinely run prison system, it actually is reformatory and has a low recidivism rate. People actually come out of it and don't better people on having been improved. So, in an absolute sense, it's a bad thing that a prison system exists. But the unfortunate reality is that there are people who need to be reformed in this way. And in a kingdom that's run well, is the king, is it the prison is doing good in the world, so it's a good thing, and it's connected to the divine king or God, so it's a good thing. But yeah, it's going to be viewed differently. So, like Prabhupada, another example, he saw people playing golf, and his disciples explained to him what golf was, and he also started crying and saying they're wasting their human form of life. We get this rare chance to take a human form and develop in God consciousness, and here they are wasting it out in a field trying to hit a ball into a hole. So there's a kind of tragedy as well of like these people here in the material world are separate from God, and they're very slow if they are making any progress on their journey back to God. But the fact is they are on a journey, and at least according to the universalist view, that's my understanding of Vaishnavism. They will get there eventually. It just might take them a really long time, and there might be a lot of suffering along the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
We should probably get back on subject. So back on Spinoza.
There's space for many things.
Yeah.
In the divine.
I find if I do a podcast where we span too many subjects, it doesn't get many views. It's better to have a subject and drive it home.
So we're looking for views. Let's talk about like abortion or what's sexy right now. Let's go.
No, it's more just giving people what they were expecting when they clicked on the video.
I know, definitely.
So Spinoza, we talked about that, and I think we were both kind of saying Spinoza's view's bad. Let's not be like Spinoza. But a lot of people watching might have never heard of Spinoza, or at least might not know what we mean by the God of Spinoza. So my understanding of it, it's something like what a Hare Krishna would call Mayavad. It's a impersonalist view that God is the universe. He doesn't have any personal qualities. He's just this sort of amorphous thing devoid of qualities.
Yeah, I think that's close to what it is. It's just that God is nature, is the universe, and this is where it becomes hard to tell what's the difference between religion and atheism. And some people even debate, like, was Spinoza an atheist, or was Spinoza making everything divine and so intimately spiritual? And I mean, that's a hard question. But I personally stay away from pantheism, the sort of pantheism of Spinoza. And I think what's so interesting about Henry Moore's view of divine space is that it makes God super close and near to us and immanent, and yet also not one with material creation in the pantheistic Spinoza sense. And that's really hard to do. I think it's easy to avoid pantheism if you make God very distant and transcendent and far away. It's really hard to avoid pantheism if you want a God who's close and personal and near to us. The closer you make God, the harder it is to make us distinct from God, and that's a hard tension. And this is one potential way of navigating that. So
I think the God of Spinoza would be something like what Adi Shankaracharya talked about, and there's a long history of heated debate between Vaishnavas, or at least especially Chaitanya Vaishnavas, and the followers of Shankaracharya. And it's on this idea of we think they're kind of just making it atheistic, and they think we're giving God qualities in a way that limits him, or I don't know, maybe I should spend more time trying to understand what the followers of Adi Shankaracharya think we're doing, but they think we're being sentimentalists and giving God a form when God doesn't have a form, and so on, or confusing the form of Krishna for an actual divine thing when really it's just something temporary that we use to fix our mind on until we're advanced enough to fix our mind on the impersonal divine, which is beyond Krishna.
Yeah.
And for us, that's a highly offensive view. That's like saying your mum is just somebody who's there to get you a little bit ahead, and once you've like out there in the world, then you can totally disown her and you don't need her anymore.
Yeah. No, I think we're on the same page with that. I think I'm pretty uncomfortable with a more Advaita Vedantist collapsing of these distinctions and transcending of anything that you try to use to understand the divine. Sorry. No, I think that's precisely what. Hey, buddy. That's awesome. I think that's precisely the sort of thing Moore is trying to avoid.
Guys, I'm just recording a podcast. Do you mind going out? Or are you just getting something?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, because I know you're fine. I think once, should I just wait?
No, it's fine.
Yeah, I think once you break down the lines between the creator and creature, and kind of go that monistic route, I think that breaks down individuality. I even think it breaks down love, actually, because I think love requires a self, an other, and a loving relation. And when you make all things one, you basically swallow up the other into this homogeneous blob. And I think it also, for me, it negates morality. and maybe I don't know what you think about this, but I think that once all is one, then good and evil are part of that one as well. And that's part of the issue. That's part of what I was pushing back at before, was to say that that's part of the thing that I'm not comfortable with. I wasn't sure which direction you were going with that. But yeah,
Oh,
that's
yeah. No, there's definitely a difference. I think like a reductio ad absurdum of the Advaita Vedanta view is that you've actually had cases of um, gurus a lot somewhere situated in that tradition saying, yeah, the goal is to meditate, to get to the point in your meditation where you can sit meditating with a piece of stool in one hand and a piece of gold in the other hand and not see any distinction.
you would say. So when you say reductio ad absurdum, do you mean a successful one or one that's like a logical fallacy
No,
or a
a
mistake?
successful one. Like another example is so Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, who is like in our tradition, like one of the most intelligent gurus. He wrote he could like debate that people who disagreed with him that would see him crossing the street would cross the road to avoid him, and he was just ridiculously intelligent. He learned English by reading
Yeah.
a dictionary, and his writing's quite hard to read as a result. But he wrote a he like when he was like 8 years old, he wrote a book on astronomy or something crazy. Maybe it was
Yeah.
11. And his teachers thought he was never listening in class. So then, because he was just busy studying other things, so then he got up and repeated everything the teacher had said all day or something crazy like that. He like, so he, where was I going with this? He, would debate Mayavadis a lot, and some of his, he didn't eat mangoes because he committed something when he was young that he saw as a spiritual event. So his rut was, I won't eat mangoes for my whole life. So when he was traveling with his disciples, the disciples wouldn't eat mangoes because it's like the guru's not eating mangoes. So they're there traveling and people give them these mangoes and they're just rotting there because no one's eating them. This impersonalist comes along and is saying everything's all the same, everything's Brahman, and they're like, okay, well then eat one of those rotten mangoes. And the guy actually did it. The guy actually ate a rotten mango in order to prove his point that everything's the same.
This diarrhea too is
Yeah.
common. Yeah, it's interesting because you said you would find it offensive to say that everything's, anytime you try to have, I think you were saying like to say that Krishna isn't it, but it's almost like there's something behind it that's actually the one, and you have to transcend that. Was that what you were saying?
Yeah. We find that highly offensive.
Yeah.
The same way you might find it offensive if I was to say your wife actually isn't your partner in life. She's just somebody you use to get ahead. And once you've got your career situated, just dump her. Get her out of your life.
Yeah. Well,
You'd be like,
I think,
hey.
well, I think on an ontological level, it's interesting because that's precisely why I don't see Jesus as just an incarnation. No, as just a temporary manifestation amongst many, because for me, Jesus isn't just transcended to reach the being he was pointed to. He is one with that entity. And it's precisely because I think on an ontological level, there isn't just oneness and unity, but there's also diversity and difference, that I don't think you can just take a step above Jesus, at least in my worldview, to get to God in a deeper sense. Because the diversity and difference of the triune three members are as fundamental as the oneness of God in itself, if that makes sense.
So,
And the reason I point that out is because in previous conversations, I think you've made a really interesting critique of, what's Jesus pointing to? But the way you articulated the defense of Krishna there almost felt like we were on the same page for a second.
Well, what you've just said now, I agree with. Obviously, I disagree with the specifics of Jesus.
Yeah.
But if we say the same thing about appearances of God that we take to be directly God, such as Sri Chaitanya, Krishna, Ram, then what you just said, I would agree with, attributed to those personalities. With regard to Jesus, we see him as something like Prabhupada, a pure devotee who's come to spread teachings of God, who's especially empowered. But we don't need to disagree about that just now, just to give some caveats. So yeah, I think with regard to the general philosophy, though, we're on the same page. We're just putting different
things
specifics
in.
into it.
Yeah. So would you actually say Krishna isn't just sort of a manifestation of a higher thing? Krishna is
Yeah,
it
Krishna is
in a
God
sense.
directly.
Like, yeah, that's interesting.
So I mean, it's a little technical, but yeah, it's God has a lot of variety. He's got varieties of personality and those personalities are directly God. It's not like a persona God puts on. It's not a facade that God's wearing in order to interact with us. This is God directly. Um, and I think maybe there'll be at times where God does put on a little bit of an act in order to interact with us. Like we look at different traditions and people are like, well, if your religion's true, then why do Muslims when they have spiritual experiences, why do they see green? It's like, well, because they have a certain expectation of how God's going to interact with them based on their idea that green's a holy color, and God reciprocates with that and interacts with them in the way they're expecting in order to, it's just the way you might with your child. If your child's expecting you to interact with them a certain way, you might do that because you're a human being interacting on a personal level, and you're going to adjust your interactions based on who you're interacting with. God does the same thing.
Because we've had previous discussions where some of the pushback that I've gotten has been this critique of Jesus being more than a manifestation. And I guess for you, it wouldn't be that there couldn't be an entity who is truly God.
Yeah, that's just.
But rather that there is that entity, but then there's also this father figure who's also it, and that there's somehow more than just the manifestation. There's you know what I'm saying here?
I get the distinction. Yeah, so when Krishna comes and appears in the material world, we don't think of him like Jesus, like that's one manifestation and then there's the Father up in heaven. This is Swayam Bhagavan Krishna, the original Supreme Personality of Godhead. And of course, anytime God appears, he's going to be manifesting a limited degree of his qualities. But so we see Krishna as the highest because the qualities that he manifests are the highest, even though it's not a full.
I guess I use manifestation, but Christians wouldn't say Jesus is a manifestation per se. They would say he is as well. They would say he is the fullness of God. It's not like it's an aspect of God manifesting in a particular context. I think we would say it is God. And then we get into the Trinity stuff and it gets confusing. But
yeah,
read my first book.
Yeah. The last discussion we had was on the Trinity. I think the pushback, just to quickly rehash it or just repeat it so people can hear it, but maybe they should just go watch that discussion we had maybe 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. But yeah, the pushback is basically like, yeah, we see God as coming and it's fully God, whereas you see God as coming and it's just sort of it's a different aspect of God, and there's still God the Father, and you call it. I think if you changed how you word it, we might agree with it more too, because it's like three persons, one God. Whereas we would say if it's God, it's the same person, but he's expressing a different personality when he appears in this way.
Yeah. Well, I want to respond, but I'm also like, well, is this another rabbit trail? Are you able to?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So in your view, what are these sort of transcendental things like time and space and being and those sort of big concepts? Like what are their relationship to the divine? Are they emanations, as you were saying before? Or
so space, I haven't really heard talked about a lot. I guess when we say, like when Prabhupada talks about this idea that there's the spiritual world, that there's the material world here and the spiritual world over there, and comments how saying actually everything is in the spiritual world, that might be talking about space. And he might just be saying there is no space outside of the spiritual world. It's just this material world that happens to be a corner of the spiritual world where there is this kind of illusion where we see things as separate from God. So that might be commenting on space. But other than that, I'm not really sure space is talked about directly anywhere. Perhaps I'm just a little bit lacking in scholarship. But time is definitely talked about. And I think a lot of the arguments that you mentioned in the book, the same argument could be translated to time because, space is here and I'm also here in time. and I can move through space, I can move through time. Someone can, you give an example of how someone could exist in the same space I'm in right now, but they just have to do it across time.
Yeah.
But so time is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, "Time, I am the destroyer of all." Doesn't sound like a very nice thing for God to be doing, going around destroying us all. But God destroys material things only. Everything spiritual is never destroyed. Like spiritual progress you made is not destroyed. You can carry that into a future birth. Of course, you don't believe in reincarnation, but on our view, and yeah, but you probably also believe that spiritual progress is maintained. You build your relationship with God. That's an eternal asset, and no one can take that away from you. So time's only destroying material things. But yeah, this idea of God being time is explicitly stated.
Yeah, well, and I think they are very, you correctly made that connection. And in many ways, I'm taking arguments that have been made for time and how we can still talk about time as a real thing post Einstein. And I'm saying, well, why don't we make those same types of arguments for space? And so I took what people said about time and I've applied it to space. And now you're saying, oh, well, let's take what you've said about space and see if it applies to time. And I say, yes, it does, because that's how it all started on my end as well.
Okay.
Which is, there's a number of philosophers like Richard Swinburne at Oxford, the apologist William Lane Craig, who you might be like, oh, the apologist, but his actual legitimate academic credential is that he does the philosophy of time. They have argued, and also physicist John Lucas have argued that Einstein didn't really relativize time per se. He just showed that we don't have access to an absolute frame of time, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. It's just you can't empirically verify it. So they would say Einstein didn't so much disprove that there's an absolute or metaphysical temporal frame of reference. He just showed that we don't need that to explain the data, that we can exist on a physics level as if there is no such absolute metaphysical frame. So he at best showed that it was superfluous, not that it doesn't exist. And so a lot of people would say, therefore, perhaps God is this absolute temporal frame of reference or something like that. So,
yeah, that makes me think of how some people say divine command theory is just subjective morality applied to God. So similarly, we could say we have the subjective frames of time and space, but then we're just calling God's subjective frame the objective one.
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, when it comes to the space thing, the space version of that, I think the difference would be that one is absolute and the others are particular. Yeah. It's not like a particular thing was made big. It's the difference between, a god like Zeus, who's just the most powerful being, and a god who is being itself. I would say just spatialized.
Yeah, right. No, I think there is an important distinction. I just thought I'd mention it because I know it's a view that comes up in this sort of discussion, or at least it does for the divine command theory, which I think the same answer you gave there applies to divine command theory. God's opinion is not just another opinion.
Yeah, God is goodness itself. Yeah, it's an absolute eternal definition of goodness that couldn't casually be changed. Yeah. So it's interesting.
Sure. This idea of absolute space and absolute time makes me think of something in quantum physics, an argument for there being no such thing as simultaneity from an objective point of view that I've never understood. I think I heard Ryan Mullins explain it, and I never really studied it to the point where I could understand what the physicists were on about, because every time they said it, I was just like, this makes no sense to me. How can they be saying that? But the idea was something about, if two objects are traveling away from each other and there's a third object and the light off one hits the light off the other, then like from every subjective point of view of those three objects, there will be a different idea of whether the two things were simultaneous. So from one point of view, the two events were simultaneous. From another point of view, they're not simultaneous. I'm like, aren't they just talking about the light hitting the observer at a different time? What does that have to do with whether the events were actually simultaneous or not?
Yeah. So I think maybe you're thinking of the train example. But to drastically oversimplify, I mean, if we're talking about Interstellar, you seen Interstellar, the movie?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, like let's say that um, Matthew McConaughey takes a timer set to go off at hour 10, and he gives his daughter back on Earth a timer set off to go um, at hour 10. I mean, they're going to go, if he goes into outer space near a black hole, the gravity is going to warp time. And so their timers are going to go off at different instants, even though they've both gone a full 10 hours. I think the idea is that there is no one moment that is simultaneous across all inertial frames throughout space and time. One potential, that was really super oversimplified, but one potential counter to that is quantum entanglement, which argues that two things can actually become entangled, and that once you are aware of how one exists and its spin, then you automatically know what happens at the other because they're entangled. And if that's the case, then that means there is some sort of simultaneity, because what you do to one of the quantum entities impacts the other instantly. And so some have said that that would actually disprove or require a new view of simultaneity that Einstein seemed to have maybe negated. So I don't know. This probably didn't help at all. This probably just made it worse.
I think you're talking about something a little bit different. If neither of us is super aware of the simultaneity thing, then we probably can't talk about it much. But I think, just to finish off my thought, I think this idea of an absolute space and an absolute time fixes that, because it's like it doesn't matter when the light hits you, because that's just a subjective perspective. What there is an absolute time in which there is absolute simultaneity, regardless of whether we can have access to knowledge of that or not, because we just have a subjective point of view which is perverted by different aspects of physics and whatnot that affect whether we perceive things as simultaneous or not, because light hits us at different times and so on. But what you spoke about is something, isn't it called time dilation?
Yeah, but I think it can kind of illustrate the deeper principle at the same time. So I don't think we're talking about exactly the same things, but
Yeah, so time dilation is something that's explicitly talked about all through Bhagavatam and elevated texts. Like there's an example where um, a king goes with his daughter up to a higher spiritual, it's still in the material world. He goes up to Brahma Loka to ask Brahma, oh, can you please help me find a husband for my daughter? And, he gets there and has to wait for a couple of minutes to talk to Brahma, speaks to Brahma, and he's like, oh, in the few minutes you've been here, your entire kingdom doesn't exist anymore. Everyone you've ever known doesn't live. But if you hurry back down, there is someone your daughter can marry. So this idea of time dilation, or there's another one where Brahma comes and has some interaction with Krishna, goes back for a minute of his time, comes back, and 1 year has passed on Earth time, even though he's only been away a minute. So this, which is fully consistent with what Einstein came up with as an idea, and was later experimentally proven that depending where you're situated in the universe, time passes differently based on speed you're moving or whatever factors. So yeah, we've talked about a few points, like if God is in space and he's material. I don't know if we want to talk about, it's like, oh no, I know where we can go. So Newton, it's this claim that sounds somewhat radical, that perhaps this idea of divine space that Moore presented is built and baked into the scientific revolution, thanks to Isaac Newton being fond of it. That sounds like a pretty radical claim. Do you want to give some points of how you might think it crops up in Newtonian physics?
Yeah. So I think just as a historical case, you can say Newton adopted this idea. He talks about it a lot in the sort of foundations of his physics. And so historically, there's a connection there. The question that I think a lot of people will say is more interesting is there not just a historical connection, but a conceptual one, where his scientific worldview was actually requiring this view of divine space? Was it doing something conceptually that was needed. And the argument I make there is that science has sort of grounded its claim to to be sort of the primary epistemological enterprise by saying that it describes reality in a sort of primary way, that it's not a subjective description, but it's an objective description. And what I argue is, well, actually, the world that science is describing would cease to be objective if we relativize the spatial frame. And Newton believes that the divine provides an absolute metaphysical divine spatial frame that makes our statements of science objective. What I mean there is that if there is no absolute spatial frame, when you say that this entity is over here, you can't make an objective absolute declaration about where it is or when it is. You can only make a relative declaration about what it is and where it is and when it is relative to other things. In which case, Newton, I think, would say that matter does not have primary qualities that are objectively in the thing itself. So, for example, we would say that something is subjective if it is not in the thing itself, but in the one who perceives the thing. It's in the subject, not the object, right? And so an example of that might be the color green. That, your perception of greenness is in the individual subject itself rather than in the object. And that's why different people, maybe a colorblind person, might perceive greenness differently, because it's in the subject, not the object. And science, by talking about location, motion, length, quantities, thought that it was making primary objective statements about the way that the world actually is. But in relativizing the spatial frame, you're no longer making primary statements about objects in and of themselves. You're only making secondary statements about how they seem to different observers in different inertial frames. In which case, science is no longer making objective claims, but secondary claims, and has no more claim to be describing reality than the secondary perspectival claims of philosophy or religion.
Yeah, right. That's interesting. I guess this question gets into lots of arguments in the book, where you talk about, like, if two objects are moving in different directions, could you say one of them stationary? And in some situations you could say something stationary where clearly it's moving just based on using a particular subjective frame, and clearly that's problematic. So having an absolute space which isn't moving solves that. And then I guess there's a question in the book of if space is an absolute thing, is this like the idea of ether that was dispensed with? Is that talked about?
Yeah. So, sorry, can you repeat the last two sentences?
If there's an absolute space, is it like a substance like ether? That's the hypothesis that was rejected a while back, right?
Yeah. So sometimes people have confused the ether and absolute space and assumed that if you negate one, you kind of negate the other. But I think the ether is almost to imagine space like it's sort of a fluid or a wind or something like that is physically impacting other things. I think the absolute space we're talking about here is more metaphysical than that, and it's less physical. It's less the sort of thing that you might be able to get a sample of. It's the thing in which samples exist in. So it also depends who you're talking about, view of ether and space, but I would define them differently in that way. So ether might be something that exists everywhere throughout space, but I don't think it is space if it were to exist.
It doesn't.
So
If your book becomes popular, do you think there'll come a day when they open some churches and people go and worship space and offer prayers to space? And
hopefully not. I mean, like I said, I don't necessarily even think that this is true. I just think it's a really interesting idea that's worth talking about, and maybe someone else will come along and show, oh, actually it is true, and maybe you should believe in it. And I'll be like, oh, that's interesting. You took us the final few steps. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't want space to supplant the divine. And even if this were to be true, I don't think space would be the entirety of the divine. It would just be one aspect, one reflection, one glimmer of the divine, who is deeper and more transcendent than that. So, yeah. But I do think it's interesting that you said churches, because churches are meant to be holy places where the sacred dwells more intimately. And the idea of divine space is precisely that all space is divine and sacred. And so I don't know if it would annihilate the idea that particular places are more intimate, but it would certainly nuance and make it interesting.
yeah, I mean, I was just kind of making a silly comment, but this gets back into the whole personalist debate where, like, you've got Advaita Vedantas saying they still open temples. And it's like, why do you open a temple? Why go to the temple and worship if God's everywhere? And I mean, there's some semblance, something along those lines that we see. The Kanishta goes into the temple, sees God there, and goes out in the world, and then just like fights and criticizes with everyone else because they're not seeing God and the people they're interacting with in their daily lives. So there's something to be said about seeing God everywhere, but there's also a special place that you go and see God. So, you know, back to the discussion we had earlier about God appearing in the world. So there's, beyond all this, we have this idea that there's a personal God that all of this is emanating from. That's where we have our loving relationship with God. That's the ultimate goal. But this space concept is an interesting thing to talk about, and perhaps has some elements of supporting a theology where you have that personal God that's beyond it.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't think space exhausts all that God is. And I mean, as a Christian, I believe God is also incarnate. God has a particular location, at least at one time. And so, well, I would say God is omnipresent. I also think God is narrowly present in other places. So, yeah.
We can probably wrap it up soon. Were there any other points you wanted to touch on?
Well, it's great. Thank you for having me on. And yeah.
Cool. I'm sure we'll do it again in the future. There was some discussions about doing some stuff on your guys' podcast too. Maybe that'll happen one day.
Yeah, that'd be great. We'd love to do that. So
cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Here's the book.
Yeah.
Check it out on Amazon. Self-promotion time. Space God.